two of the juggernauts of their field, my friends. Jon F White, one of the world's leading researchers into ancient myths and mythology and how this plays a role through human civilization, and Matthew Lacroix, best-selling author and ancient history researcher who is literally trying to change the world on his expeditions through Turkey and other areas. Now, we decided to get these guys together because they have very differing opinions on these ancient myths and teachings. And so what we've done is given Matt a 3,000-year-old sword and John an ancient Komodo dragon, and we have put them in a cage to fight to the death for 1 hour. Let's see who comes out. Enjoy the I'm just kidding. In all seriousness, we cover so much in this podcast. Are there any truths to these myths? What are the real origins of our society? Was the historical Jesus even real? What in God's name is the truth behind the Great Flood myth? And was Atlantis real or not? We have some answers for you today. Go check out everything. Links to exclusive videos and more content are on thewayofwilljon.com right down below. Leave us a like, comment, and subscribe. Check us out on Apple Podcasts. Check out our Rumble. And of course, the PayPal address and the Bitcoin address are right down below. We need money for the insurance to actually make this death match happen. We love you guys. We will see you soon. Peace. I will get this going. Everybody, a warm welcome into the very first of this style of podcast. Now, we have here today two individuals with which I binge from time to time all of their content. And so if you are fans of the channel, which of course you are, since this is the greatest podcast ever, you guys are a very warm welcome to Jon F White and Matthew Lacroix. Since, John, you're here to my left, why don't you just give us a little bit of an intro into who you are, and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Will. And how do you do, Matt? I'm Jon F White. Most people know me from my YouTube channel, 𝗪𝗚𝗡. I'm also the creator of the Mythology database online, which basically is a catalogue of the world's myths and folktales distributed by across 1,100 traditions or cultures or locations. And we use that to understand myths, understand the source of myths, and try and understand the story behind myths. So that's me in a nutshell. And I make videos every couple of weeks explaining certain folktales and myths, their origins, how they spread, why they spread.
And my name is Matthew Lacroix. I'm an author and ancient history expert who has been studying, I guess, the other side of what John studies, both myth and legend, but as well as trying to understand if there's aspects of literalism and aspects of some parts of these stories, if they're talking about real events, real places, where it's kind of a blurry line between, what is being literal and what's talking about something that maybe needs to teach us a lesson, or something celestial, or something to do with cycles. So I'm very much looking forward to talking to John to hear his side on it.
TheWayofWillJon.com, exclusive content and programs on manifestation, making money, hidden knowledge. Finally, reach your full potential. So let's start with you, Matt, because you've had some very exciting times over the last, let's say, 6 months to a year, in the revelations and things that you have come up with. So I think a good place to start would be on one of the theories and in your research that you're working on right now. And so could you maybe just give us a good understanding of what it is that you believe you found and what the implications are for what you've discovered?
Thanks, Will. Yeah, one of the areas that I really became almost enamored, borderline obsessed with, was studying cuneiform stories from the Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, Chaldeans, and I guess basically you could say Mesopotamian stories, and looking for aspects of whether or not there were real locations mentioned, actual people that existed, kings that existed, and what was considered mythology. Discussing celestial aspects of the cosmos like Taurus or Orion versus talking about some kind of a real event. And that area was of particular interest to me because I was studying origin points of the original Sumerian cities, some of these kingship original cities that were lowered and had potentially, had existed long ago in the past, but had largely, from most academics, had been considered a myth. And that was the way it was with a lot of different things, like, for instance, like an ancient Greek city like Troy right? In Homer's Odyssey and the whole stories behind the Greek mythology. And of course, if like John knows, in the late 1800s, Troy was discovered. So we have an interesting place where we're looking at the two different sides of it and saying, well, what is mythology and what is actual being literal? And so I think John and I probably have a lot in common with these conversations, but it'll be interesting to see the little small areas that we slightly differ in our understanding. Now, like what Will was bringing up, what did that lead to? Well, when I was studying one of the original Sumerian cities called 𝗪𝗪𝗛𝗪, it was actually the last of the original 5 cities that was discussed in many, many tablets, including the Sumerian King List, Eridu-Genesis, and others. That city was considered a myth before it was discovered in 1931, when archaeologists, primarily German archaeologists, with some American archaeologists, were in Iraq, and they were excavating underneath a place called 𝗪𝗪𝗪. Which is the modern day name today of a location that was on the surface. And they believed that that location underneath it somewhere was this ancient city that had been, again, considered a myth. And that's a whole conversation we can get down into, but let's just say that studying that, those papers that came out of that, and the comparisons between the mythological stories of a great deluge destroying an ancient city that then became a myth to later cultures was very much, to me, was some smoking evidence that I was looking at, that something else was going on here, that there was some literal truth to these locations, that something real had happened. Now, go forward, what had really come out of that was I fell into some of these archaeological discoveries. This is going forward a couple of years. I fell into some archaeological discoveries starting last year, 2023, of what's going on in Eastern Turkey around Lake Van specifically, with sites that most of the world had never heard of because they were very new. Like, give you an example, a lot of people still consider Göbekli Tepe the new kid in the block, but yet that's been excavated since the 1940s. So that's really not new at all. If anything, something like Ionis, which is I discuss all the time, Ionis Kalesi, found in the 2000s, is like the new kid in the block. That's where you really get into really looking at something brand new. Now, what is important about that region is that it had direct connections, I believe, back to the original Sumerian stories and the myths of an event that led to this ancient sage priest king known as Untapishtim or Zayasudra, depending on the culture, landing and surviving in Eastern Turkey and creating a mysterious civilization there. A civilization that then, I believe, became the origins of even like the pre-Greeks, the pre-Athenians, and all of these stories around this lost time period of history. And so I've been now going deep into this with all of these sites, and I've now amassed quite a team, which could involve Will in the future, actually. Quite a team that is of archaeologists and geologists and sacred geometry experts and mythology experts and religious experts and ancient experts to go in to these sites and, number one, try to see if we can prove that they're far older than we're told by mainstream archaeologists, but 2, to see if it connects to the ancient mythos and connects to this mysterious time in history when I believe that we had an entire lost chapter of our story that became wiped out and disappeared, almost became like a memory, like Graham Hancock says, a species with amnesia, where we forgot about who we are and what we used to be and the places and the locations and the civilizations that used to exist here. And that's where I think myth and legend comes in a very, very important way, because a lot of those things are so old. That, right? Isn't there like that famous quote in Lord of the Rings, right, where Gandalf says something like things eventually become a myth and then legend, and then they before long you don't even think they're real anymore because they're so old. And I think that's what we're really looking at here, are stories and events that are so ancient that most people don't even believe that they still exist or ever existed. And so that's the area that we're really dabbling, really going deep into with a lot of experts, is uncovering these mysteries and trying to understand what's fact versus what's fiction.
Incredibly fascinating. Obviously, I'm very well versed in your work. Now, John, I know that some of that will be new to you. I would love to hear your thoughts, sir?
So, first off, I have to say, I'm approaching this with an open mind, because if you found something fascinating, I mean, I read Graham Hancock's Fingerprints of the Gods when I was in my late teens and thought it was amazing. Less so now, to be honest. And so, but I'll probably, because if you found something like that, that's good. So I'm particularly interested, in what you found at these sites, but also the event that has happened that created this amnesia. So I'd imagine you're going to be talking about a flood type event, because I'm aware that 𝗪𝗪𝗛𝗡, there is a sort of diluvian event between some of the archaeology. And obviously, if you're talking Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh and flood myths are all over there. And I'd love to talk about it, because there's lots of tie-ins with many myths and many stories that you may not be so familiar with, or do not realise that there are these links. So I'm happy to see what I can bring to your sort of table that you can feed on. Yeah.
Could I get a good understanding then, John? Can you get us a good understanding of the flood myth as we know it, and as well as the time frame? Because, you know, when you guys start getting to the numbers like you guys do, saying 10,000, 80,000, for those of us over here, we don't, you know, so can you give us a good idea of where this?
Yes. So there could be some spoilers for later on here, but we can start this. So the flood myth is quite complicated, but it starts with a creation myth. So what I do, for those who don't understand, is we collect stories from around the world. We've got about 1,200 locations, traditions we would call them, where we collect stories and we categorise those into different motifs. And that allows us to filter these stories together. And we can draw maps. And if you go to mythologydatabase.com, which I run, you can look up one of these motifs and it'll show you a map of the world where the stories dispersed across. And from this data and other techniques, which we call phylogenetics, we can create a probabilistic chart of where a story came from. So we can, certain stories you can say, I've started in Europe or Africa or Australia or wherever. So we have this creation myth. And the earliest main creation myth is called the Earth Diver. And basically, in our first creation myths, the world was just water. There was no gods, it was just water. And on the water floated a bird. There are other animals or people, but most often it's a bird, and the bird dives down to the bottom of this sea, brings up some mud, and when it gets to the surface, the mud turns to land. And that's how we thought the world was created. Now, as this myth disperses out of Africa and into Asia, we see it develop. And it develops for a number of reasons. One, because myths change with society and landscape, but also because things change. People have different beliefs, different reasons, different symbology to put into myths. And so what we see is that where there isn't a sea, where cultures live where there isn't a sea, it makes no sense to have a creation myth that is full of a sea. So they have a creation myth where things flood. And you may say, well, what happened to the Earth Diver myth? Well, if you know the myth of Noah, which I'm sure you do, Matt.
We'll be talking a lot about that.
Yeah, well, he there is no earth diver, but does he have a bird in his myth that goes off to get some land and come back?
There's a dove, and there's also a raven, like a crow.
Crow, yeah, exactly. That is the earth diver motif, just literally turned 90 degrees. So the bird is no longer diving to get land. They've kept the bird motif, and the bird now goes off to get land to bring it back to say, hey, there's land. But that's how myths change, and we can see a clear development of that creation myth into that. Now, our analysis suggests that basically through saying it couldn't have started particular places because of the location and how stories develop, it's our belief that story started, and this is a peer-reviewed paper by 𝗪𝗪𝗛𝗡 in Southeast Asia 30,000 years ago. Now, that interested me. I've done a very brief amount of looking at some of your videos, because you've got so many, it's impossible to look at them all in a week. So but I've had a brief look, and you talk about cycles and flood cycles potentially. And if it's 30,000 years ago, that may be far too early for a flood myth in the time you usually talk about, but that could maybe link to a cycle before.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. I certainly agree.
So that's the myths, but can also add what a myth is, because there is general academic consensus of what a myth is, although the words slightly vary. But myths are stories that do have truths. Okay, that's really important. And that's why they are maintained, because of those truths. But those truths aren't necessarily factual or historic, certainly in terms of how we study them. They are sacred. So they are religious truths, and that is why they persist. Okay, so when you see a story that has a god or a divine being in it, there's often some religious truth in that, and that is why that part of the myth is maintained over generations, over thousands of years. You will see these continue. And as I say, the Earth Diver myth is told even today in First Nation American tribes, and yet we know it's definitely come out of Africa, that myth, as a creation myth. So that's a synopsis of what I do and the flood myth and where it's come from in a nutshell.
Round 2, fight!
Can I ask, and now I believe back to Matt, if I'm correct, you guys wanted to discuss, obviously, the Epic of Gilgamesh. There's two other aspects of this, prehistoric time that I obviously want to get into. The first one being Epic of Gilgamesh, Noah, and the rest of, and obviously, Matt,
Sure.
you can respond to that. And then, of course, after this, we cannot not get into my one and only favorite, Atlantis, which I love to just to get an understanding of from all angles. But yeah, starting with the Epic of Gilgamesh and what you understand of the myths and stuff that you're pulling to be potentially historic, literal, and fact, where do you place that in this giant pantheon of flood myth, Matt, and how important it is, etc.?
Can I answer to what John said first really quick before we get into Gilgamesh?
Please do, yeah.
Of course.
So, and again, John, I totally respect. I just I'll present my side of how I view that. I look at these flood myths in different categories. So when you say like, well, there's a flood, well, what flood are you talking about? Again, we're going to jump into Plato and Solon and really get into Atlantis and talk about, well, we know that the temple priests of Sais talked to Solon and told him, you Greeks remember one deluge, but there have been many, particularly of water and fire. So they talk, you remember that probably very well, John, is that they're discussing these different events and different things in history. Now, are they talking about the creation of Earth and the primordial aspects of Earth? Or are they talking about multiple different events? Like, even to give you an example, we know in a lot of Native American traditions that they discuss this aspect of the earth and land being represented with a turtle. A turtle being like where the land has risen up and the turtle kind of like travels throughout the world, and it's the land of the earth, and it discusses this aspect of like creation aspect. And I agree with John. I think that some of these stories around the world are talking about literally like the creation of earth here and the creation of life and the creation of land, all the things that happen. I think that's true. And I think maybe what, in my opinion, some of the confusion is getting is that there are creation stories and then there are actual event stories, and sometimes the two are getting meshed. And it's like, wait a minute, are we talking about like what Gilgamesh is talking about? Or are we talking about something that's like a 𝗪𝗟 and talking about the early primordial earth and Tiamat? And that's where you get some confusion, because there are certainly creation stories that I think are very defined. Like, I think the 𝗪𝗟 is very clearly talking about the creation of this earth as we know it. Maybe it was in an unbalanced, chaotic state earlier on, and it was talking about this balance, bringing balance to it and harmony and all the things that happened. But what about discussing something like, again, let's get into the Noah mythos for a minute. What about how Ziusudra, who is his original Sumerian name, Untapishtim became his Akkadian name. What about how he discusses a great deluge that destroyed the ancient world, and how he was warned prior to this deluge, and then he subsequently with his family survived this event in the Ararat Mountains? Well, again, the Shuruppak excavations from 1931, if you read that paper from Penn University, you'll find that there was an entire conclusion section that they discussed in great length at the end, where they couldn't help noticing the correlations between the deluge story in the Atrahasis and the Epic of Gilgamesh and others that has very strong evidence around an actual event. And let me give you an example. When they were digging down into first Shuruppak, they found it at the lowermost layer, and they found it at almost 20 feet down. They found this layer, right, where they found 𝗪𝗪𝗛𝗡. Well, the interesting thing was that they found 3 different civilizations there, and they called them stratum 1, 2, and 3. And stratum 1 is on the bottommost, stratum 2 is in the middle, stratum 3 was on the top. Now, stratum 2 was where they found evidence of the time of Gilgamesh. And they called it the dynasties of Ur, okay? Ur in Uruk, and they talked about how Gilgamesh was around during that time, and that's where all the tablets were. Those tablets were talking about a previous age. And they were just, because of course, if you're a civilization that gets destroyed, you're not the ones writing about it, right? It would have to be another subsequent culture that came along. It's like, wow, we know all about the stories. We're going to write down the stories of these ancestors, these proto group of original Sumerians that were here, and then we're going to discuss their stories. Now, what part of those stories is about creation versus what part is talking about an actual event that occurred to them? And I agree with John, the lines get very blurred because they've got all kinds of tablets talking about creation, all kinds of them. And then there's other ones talking about floods. Now let's get into a specific example. How about something like the legend of Etana? I don't know if John's read the Legend of Etana, but in the Legend of Etana, it discusses a number of cities that existed, a great deluge, and then kingship having to be relowered again, but to a different place. So the original 5 cities that are created, they're all destroyed according to these stories. And then kingship and civilization has to reemerge again, but it doesn't reemerge in the same place. It reemerges in a place called Kish. Okay, but it wasn't there to start. It was like those places were so buried that they were gone, and then something new had to get started. But what I find fascinating about that is that, again, the idea that there's another civilization that emerges out of the destruction of a previous one is very much echoed by the layers of the 𝗪𝗪𝗛𝗡 excavations, because they found 3 civilizations, 3, and the one that stratum 2 in the middle had a massive inundation layer right below it. Massive, 3 to 4 feet thick, that was totally sterile, only alluvial material, sand and mud, that had accumulated, no signs of human evidence at all. Now, what was interesting is when they got down to the original 𝗪𝗪𝗛𝗡, stratum 1, they found that the archaeological evidence was scattered. And one of the conclusions they came to was that the people had left in a great hurry. They had taken most of their belongings, and they had only left whatever was that had made it there that got buried. But it's interesting because they seem to have been warned by some great event. Now, I know what John might say here. John might say, well, and I'm not going to put words in John's mouth, but
don't worry, he'll say what he's going to say soon.
What about that being a regional event? Like a regional flood event, like the spring flooding of the Euphrates River, creating a regional event that they think is worldwide, thus creating this idea of a flood. Well, that's interesting and possible, but the problem with that is that when they excavated Eridu, they found an entire layer of seashells on the uppermost stratum of that ziggurat temple that is, to me, only indicative of a massive ocean flooding event, not a river flooding event. And that brings up, again, questions about, well, if it was a river flooding event, then why would they end up in the Ararat Mountains? How does that work? If you have a regional flooding event, you're going to hang on to some little island somewhere and kind of wait it out and stay there. You're not gonna end up hundreds and hundreds of miles away in a mountain region. So there's some issues there. The other thing about it is in the Epic of Gilgamesh clearly talks about this journey where he goes to see 𝗪𝗛𝗡, the great flood hero from the story, and he has a conversation with Gilgamesh where he says, "Oh, Gilgamesh, you don't remember, but there was an ancient city far older than you called 𝗪𝗪𝗛𝗡, that the gods were once in it." He says that the gods were once in it, and he talks about it being from a different time. So I'm very curious to get John's thoughts, but clearly there are events described in them. But then in the Epic of Gilgamesh, they talk all about this, celestial bat in the heavens with different constellations and stars and different time periods. So I agree that there's mythology woven into that as well. But at what point do we say, well, wait a minute, what about him being a tyrant king of the city of Uruk? So that's real. he was really there. We found Uruk. We know it's a real city in a real place. So it's interesting to try to separate that aspect of literalism versus what is clearly is mythology and celestial aspects.
Go for it, John.
That's a lot, I know.
There is a lot to unpack there. Well, so first off, a quickie, Eridu shouldn't have seashells, but we forget geology changes things. And the Persian Gulf was far higher up the Tigris and Euphrates back then. Literally, they were coastal cities. They weren't hundreds of miles away from the Persian Gulf. So that's how you can get seashells there. Secondly, I agree, myth is, well, in effect, influenced by landscape and society. I say this a lot. So localised events will influence myth. So if there is a flood myth that people know and you sit somewhere and there's a big flood, that myth will persist and will evolve to take shape of local events. So I see that. Now, 𝗪𝗪𝗛𝗡's quite interesting because I'm very familiar with, or pretty familiar, I think it's Eric Schmidt who wrote the paper in 1931.
Good job, impressive.
So, because he writes about how the influence, as you say, of the diluvian layer probably
he was a German archaeologist.
Myths.
Yeah,
exactly, absolutely. Yes, Schmidt sort of gives it away a bit, but yes. But he also says, I am absolutely sure that the layer underneath that event is literally from 3000 BC and the end of, is it the Jasmet period or Jasmet?
Yes, very impressive, John. You're well studied.
Jemdet Nassar period. So that which to the average archaeologist, geologist would be at 3000 BC and not maybe at a catastrophe type date, because we haven't really talked about the Younger Dryas period, which I'm impressed with so far, but I'm sure we're going to talk about Younger Dryas at some point, because that's quite important, because that's again misunderstood and what its influence on the world. So yes, there's a number of things there we need to be more particular about, because the way you talk about it sounds really amazing, but if you get to the details, that it may not be as old as you're insinuating from the records we see from Eric Schmidt, who you quote about having an influence on the flood myth. So I would also like, I guess, to talk about, you see different civilizations. Sometimes they're not different civilizations, just societies that develop in time. You're not getting a complete different race of people. Your genetic makeup can be consistent in those. But what I'm really interested in, because you mentioned the Epic of Gilgamesh, is why this flood occurred. Because you say they had pre-warning, which I'm a little sceptical about.
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Pre-warning. So someone told them, there's a flood, so everybody left.
Okay.
Now, I believe the Epic of Gilgamesh talks about the reason for the flood is that there's people allowed, or there's too much noise going on.
That's in the Atrahasis.
Like that.
Yeah, Atrahasis.
But also in the 𝗪𝗓𝗡 Elish, I think that you have some of this as well. This is what I want to talk about. So this is really interesting, this aspect of the world is loud, there's too many people, we have to do something about it as a myth, because we see this in these Near Eastern myths. But in the 𝗪𝗓𝗡 Elish, it's exactly the reason why Tiamat, who is the primordial mother, in effect, her name means the deep, and there's some fantastic stuff about her we could go into, and Apsu, her consort, her husband, meaning the shallows or the fresh water, he wants to kill his children because they're too noisy. And it is Tiamat who then kills Apsu, or get Apsu killed because of that. And these beings, Apsu and Tiamat, represent water. So in effect, they are you could argue, an analogy or an aspect of the same type of myth. But what is even more interesting to me is that you talked about the Iliad earlier. So not many people understand what the Iliad was really about, or the Trojan War. Okay, so most people think the Iliad's about the wrath of Achilles. He's been annoyed with Agamemnon or with Hector, who killed his best friend. But if you talk to a Greek classicist, they would say it's about two weddings. There was a wedding where Zeus got the king of Sparta's wife pregnant when he was a swan, and she laid some eggs. Eggs were very interesting. Lots of myths came out of those, but one of those eggs was Helen of Troy. And Helen of Troy became the most beautiful woman in the world. Everybody wanted to marry her, And basically they set up a peace treaty saying whoever marries her, we'll all get together and make sure no one abducts her. Okay? And if you do, we'll have a war. And then there's another wedding where there was a goddess who didn't want to marry any gods, so Zeus said marry a mortal. She decides to do that and has a party on Olympus, invites everybody along except for the goddess of discord. So the goddess of discord decides to turn up and create some discord, because what else would you expect? And she does this by having a golden apple, saying, this is for the most beautiful person here. And all the goddesses start arguing, oh, this apple's for me. They go up to Zeus and say, who's the apple for? He's a very smart man. He goes, I'm not going to choose. Probably the best decision he ever made, because that would have resulted in lots of arguing. So they go to Earth and find a mortal man who was Paris, the prince of Sparta, and ask him. And basically, Aphrodite says, look, if you choose me, Paris, as the most beautiful person, I'll make sure you'll marry the most beautiful woman in the world. That's Helen of Troy. He gets off with her, big war starts. And most people think that is the reason for the Trojan War, the Iliad. It's not. If you read the third line of the Iliad, it says, basically, Zeus wanted a war because there were too many people. And then if you look at another Indo-European epic, because these are part of Indo-European stories, the 𝗪𝗪𝗛𝗡, which is from India, exactly the same. It is, in fact, if the Greek epic cycle still remained in all its books, it would be literally the equivalent of the 𝗪𝗪𝗛𝗡. There's so many coincidences, it's unreal. That's a story about too many people in this world. There is a consistent theme amongst societies, even though split from the Near East and the agricultural to the Indo-European with pastoral. We see this motif that they have to have this epic story, that there's too many people and they need to be destroyed. So that's a really interesting piece of myth that I think you may want to do something with, Matt. You know, I don't know what, but to me it's fascinating hearing this and seeing that this is consistent. I think that is fascinating. So yeah, they're my views on that. But I could talk for about 6 hours on this.
I know you both could.
I'm impressed. John, I'm impressed with your knowledge base.
Oh, thank you. I like reading a lot.
Yeah, John and I have both gone off on modern society on their non-love of reading, which Matt, we haven't, but we've gone off on other parts of society for their lack of concentration. So we all share that in common for sure. We may come back to this little area here, but I'm not sure which, and you guys will obviously be able to correct me as I'm looking at my notes here. Is just, I know we have to touch on the Younger Dryas period, but is this in, correct me if I'm wrong, either one of you obviously, but where does this fall then between the Atlantis myth? Well before? Does Atlantis come well before? Or does this supposedly, when people are talking about the literal Atlantis, would this have been that time before? After? I think we are to you, John.
I cannot answer that question, Will, can I?
You have to answer this question in the way that tells us what you believe the Atlantis myth is. Yeah,
I believe that, so to me, Atlantis is not a real place. There's no evidence for it that I am aware of. It is just an allegory of the state of Egyptian society versus Greek society. That's how I look at it. Many people assume it happened post-Younger Dryas period or around that, especially Mr. H, we're calling him. I don't want to give him any more credit than that. If this gets transcript. So yeah, that's it. He believes that the Younger Dryas period caused mass flooding, or if not, if he doesn't say the Younger Dryas period, he'll talk about melt pulse waters, which we can also talk about. But I won't go into the Younger Dryas yet until you're ready. But that's my view, is that Atlantis would have happened post-Younger Dryas, but not far afterwards.
Okay. Before you answer that, Matt, could we get just a proper understanding of the story and how we have the story of Atlantis? I don't know which one of you would feel more adept to tell that, since I'm looking for, I guess, just to put an end to your, not speech, but just the things that you've just said here, John. Could you tell us,
go ahead, John, where
we have this story from and what it is?
There isn't much to say at all about it, really. Solon goes to Egypt. A line that's mentioned, I think it's literally one line in Herodotus's histories. Solon went on his travels, went to Egypt. There's a bit like that. And I think Plato in his, Tumulus book has a little bit more about it, but that's
His elder,
yeah. He doesn't give us too much information. It's the fact that Hancock grasps onto Solon visiting Egypt and the times talked about that he tries to come up with this period. But I haven't really studied it because
You don't see much there.
I've got better things to do.
Mm-hmm.
But
Good answer,
Matt may convince me otherwise.
Please do, Matt.
I can go ahead and
ahead.
fill that in. Yeah. The traditional story is Solon is the first Westerner that visits Egypt in a very, very, very long time, before the memory of essentially the Western world. And he visits Egypt and he goes to an island right off of Alexandria, a place that's no longer there, and there's a temple on it called the Temple of Sais, S-A-I-S. And the Temple of Sais, and this is, of course, very extensively discussed by my good friend Randall Carlson as well as Graham Hancock, but it's discussed how the Temple of Sais, the entire purpose of it was to be a catalog of ancient history, and that's its purpose was a temple that recorded the ancient past. That's what they state, and that on the walls there was the stories of our ancestors and our ancient past long before we remember it. And that was what legend has it that the actual temple contained. Now, do we have any verification on that other than that story? No. But what we know is that Solon met with a very specific elder priest named Sanchez. And Sanchez was a head elder priest of these ancient Egyptian mysteries, and according to him, he was the only one left alive that even knew the full story. He was like the elder priest of that kind of memory, and there was other priests with him. But he told Solon, "You Greeks remember only one deluge, but there have been many, primarily of water and fire," he says, and he goes on to describe different aspects. Now, what's fascinating, though, about the Atlantis story, and we get into other aspects as well, is that Solon comes back and he tells Timaeus, like a great ancestor of Plato, not Plato. Plato wasn't even around yet, but this story gets carried down with different family groups and ancestry from Solon and Socrates. It was basically a great ancestor of Socrates, and actually Socrates was then told, and Socrates is the one who told Plato. Now, Socrates didn't believe that anything should be written down because he said it could be misinterpreted. And so what essentially happened was when Socrates was murdered and poisoned by his government, Plato took it under his wing to record and keep track of basically all the knowledge of Socrates. We only know of the knowledge of Socrates because of Plato. Now, my opinion, John, is that the reason why Plato created all the allegories around it was primarily for two reasons. One, yes, there's a perfect example of seeing the differences between the Greek culture and the Egyptians, and the idea of an empire building versus like a democracy and corruption and all those aspects. But the other thing was, what would have happened though if he didn't? I'm curious, John, during that time period, imagine your great mentor teacher, Socrates, like taught you everything you know. Imagine he's murdered right in front of you, poisoned, because he's speaking out. Would you then write down the story of Atlantis in just a very literal way and be like, I'm not too worried about it, guys. Let's put this out there and see how it does. Plato wouldn't be here. Plato would have gotten killed. Plato would have gotten murdered. So my theory here is that the reason why Plato created allegories around this was because it would, number one, the knowledge would have got him, he would have died from blasphemy against the church and all these different things. But also, there's this concept woven throughout history from sages and mystics, and this idea that truth is always hidden within allegory so that only those who are initiates can understand it. So there's this idea that you can't just give the knowledge of the ancients and knowledge of all of these things that make up more divine things. Just you can't hand it out because it can end up in the hands of the wrong kind of individuals. And so one of the things we find throughout history, whether or not it's Hermetic texts or Mesopotamian texts, or like we're talking about right now, like Plato's text, is that they're all hidden within allegory. And it's interesting to see and wonder why they did that. And again, I think it's because it's for initiates that can understand and see and understand symbolism. Like Manly P. Hall said, once the truth and the understanding of symbolism and is understood by essentially the masses, a great veil will be lifted from society, because it's a way to protect a message so that only those who can understand it. Now, before you jump in, John, the interesting thing about that story, though, is that Plato says that Atlantis was destroyed, and he describes it as essentially like this time period. He says it's so many thousands of years before Solon existed, right? And I know that John knows this, if you take the numbers that they gave for like, this is how long it was destroyed before, and then you add up when Plato existed and Solon, you get this very bizarre number. You get exactly 11,600 years ago. Now, what's fascinating about that is if you study ice cores and you study the climatic data from the Younger Dryas, you learn that at 11,600 years ago, you had the very end, the terminus, what's called the terminus of the Younger Dryas, meaning that we find the most volatility and temperature gradients, CO2, as well as climatic and disruptive Earth events at that exact date. Now, the other thing to add on is very interesting that if you look at the descriptions of where Plato says Atlantis is, he talks about it being west of the Pillars of Hercules, in this area of the world that today very much aligns with the Azores. Now, Randall Carlson, who I've had extensive conversations about, who's a very good geologist, likes to point out that the Azores also happens to be the best example of a submerged continent that we have still today. Where if you look at a satellite image of the Azores in the Atlantic Ocean, you'll see that number one, it falls on 3 different plate boundaries, one of the most volatile areas of the world, but also it has a massive sunken plateau of land that is still relatively shallow compared to all the oceans around it. And it looks like, and geologically can speak to the idea that an actual tectonic event can subduct an entire piece of land. It can literally sink into the ocean. And we have seen that. We know that Earth's history is violent and that pieces of land, like give you an example, I used to live in Colorado. And in Colorado, you hike way up to like 14,000 feet up in the Colorado Rockies, and you see seashells up there. You see fossils. In some places, you're like, whoa, what's going on here? Well, you learned that once was a flat part of the ocean, that it was once land, that it was subducted, that the ocean covered, and then massive tectonic events uplifted it to a very high place, plateau, and then boom, you have fossils. But that's from millions of years ago. I'm not confusing that with more current times. We're just simply pointing out, look, different parts of the Earth and different time periods can have disastrous tectonic effects and extreme events. Now, geologists are going to tell us that all Earth's history is based on gradualism. Okay. Now I'm a pretty well self-trained geology guy and climatologist guy who studies it for well over a decade. And I can tell you that is true in most cases. Most of these huge events we're looking at in mountain building events did happen during a gradualism, meaning over time. However, there looks like there have been specific times in history, usually related to getting out of a glacial cycle during an interglacial cycle, when it looks like you get massive disruptions to the magnetosphere of the Earth, the poles, moving different things around, causing what I believe, based on a man named Hapgood, is called Earth crust displacement. If you think about the tectonic plates moving around, and generally they move very slowly, and you get like a little earthquake as it kind of bumps up against it, right? You get like we just had like a 5.5 here in California, kind of shook the house a little bit. You're like, woo, right? But that's nothing. Now let's imagine an actual event where the entire Earth gets disrupted based on the weight of ice on land masses, as well as coronal mass ejections and sun activity that are disrupting the magnetic poles. If you get a disruption significant enough and you start having entire movements of tectonic activity that are slipping and moving and diving under one another during these periods of time, it helps explain how you could get absolutely massive events around the Earth. Massive, to the point where you could have enough happen to completely wipe out an entire chapter of human civilization. Now, I want to add one more thing, John, before you jump in. When we're looking at the megalithic building techniques of certain civilizations, like Graham talks about, where we call them the lost civilizations. And I'm curious to know if John actually believes in lost civilizations, or if he's more of traditional with the 6,000 year narrative of civilizations emerging. But what we find is that there's very distinctive building styles around the world that are, some of them are almost alien. And I use that not in a term saying they're built by aliens, but they seem bizarre. Some of the building styles are so perfect and so gigantic and so well done that we would sometimes, or even be unable to create what they're doing today. And I mean, you look at the Great Pyramid of Giza, for example, 2.5 million stone blocks, an average of 5 to 10 tons each. But the issue there is, how would they, with the knowledge they had, be able to create something so mathematically precise based on the ratios of the Earth, the Sun, and the Moon, and being like a half hemisphere relation of our Earth? How would they know all of that if they were from an Iron or Bronze Age civilization? Because we're told that civilizations emerge in a gradualism way, just like geology. Nothing happens in an extreme way. Civilizations don't rise up and then disappear and then rise up again. It's literally been a slight gradualism increase from technology from 6,000 years ago, when we left being nomadic hunter-gatherers, and then all of a sudden agriculture and mathematics, and we started to emerge as a civilization, and then slowly we got to where we are today. The problem with that is that there are so many structures and telltale megalithic designs that are so precise and so advanced that we have no idea how they built them, when they built them, but surely we know that a Bronze or an Iron Age culture wouldn't have the capability to build them, because we know that there was building that was done on top of them. And the building on top of them, like an example like Machu Picchu, the Inca knew how to use a type of brick and mortar with crude stones, and that's how they built all their walls. But then why do we have these highly sophisticated, giant granite megalithic blocks that are seamlessly put together? And if the Inca built them, then why couldn't they build any more? Why did they all of a sudden change their building style to a primitive way? And one more example I want to give. In my work in Eastern Turkey around Lake Van, we see the same thing. Archaeologists are crediting these sites as being built by the Urartians, except I point out over and over again, why are the basis of all these temples giant basalt and andesite blocks, and then the Urartians were building with mud brick and crude stone? If they could do what they were doing below, then why didn't they ever do it again? And why didn't any culture ever do it again? So those are like what we're at, or the questions we're asking. And it deals with Atlantis, because I believe Atlantis was from a completely lost time period of our history, that we forgot all of it. We forgot the sophistication of the building. We lost our understanding of the divine concepts of the earth and the heavens and the cosmos and balance and all of these very fundamental things. And we almost became like reset. And then we had to get back to that point. But anyway, there's a lot to unpack there, John.
Please do, though, John. What stands out to you?
There's no way I could answer all of those in the same way.
But there must be something.
So, and I'm not an archaeologist, as I've said.
No.
I'm a mythologist, but
definitely.
many of these have been tackled by people far better qualified than I. So I don't even know where. So what I would say is, yes, there are geological events on the Earth that can wipe out masses of land. We've seen that. The one I'm more familiar with recently is the removal pretty much of the whole of Doggerland, which was the landmass between Great Britain and Europe, with an underwater sort of landslide, in effect, which created a tsunami that literally wiped out a majority of the land between what was left of the land anyway, between Britain and Europe. So yes, absolutely familiar with that. It doesn't mean I can conjure something up that explains Atlantis, though. I mean, I'd look for geologists to come at that. But as I say, everything I have read from people in peer-reviewed papers and academically suggest that this wasn't the case. In terms of the Younger Dryas, and so the view is with this terminal event, Will, is that the world suddenly became cold and became hot again over 1,000 years. In 1,000 years, suddenly cold, 1,000 years later, back to normal and actually rising. And there's all sorts of theories for that. Probably the most popular one is a comet burst in the atmosphere in the northern hemisphere, because the Younger Dryas event doesn't seem to have affected the whole planet, predominantly the northern hemisphere of the planet.
That's where the megafauna die-offs were primarily.
Yeah, yes, exactly. And people did talk about a meteor crater in Greenland, but that's been shown to be about 13 million years old.
Yeah, because it's millions of years old. It's under the ice,
exactly,
so they can't.
Exactly. So, but just if you've heard that, that's it. So, yes, something happened, but. And whilst there is sea level rise, and there has always been sea level rise, I am not aware of any significant immediate sea level rise. Certainly, we're talking centimetres a year. It goes up rather than suddenly. I see evidence, certainly across the whole northern hemisphere, of it going up more than 2 metres or 3 metres or 4 metres or 10 feet. It just, I do not believe that evidence exists. So,
what about the ice, though? The water locked up into ice during the last ice age with the Laurentide ice sheet. What about putting that into understanding for the volume of water on the Earth versus having a lot of it?
The increase, yes, sea levels go up. As I say, sea levels went up 40 metres between 14 and 10,000 years ago. 40 metres, 120, 130 feet. That's a lot of sea level. But if you look at it, it's like a centimetre a year or something on average. So, I mean, there would be years where it went up a lot more. But again, there's nothing significant. Plus also, as you say, is that the weight of the ice on land also pushed land down. So we actually see sea level drops in some places as land rises back again. So you can't just measure it based on where the sea level is now, sort of thing. There is just to say geographic movement, and I get that. As for architecture looking similar, and why is there better architecture, and civilizations don't just come and go?
That are older versus younger, right?
Well, you look at the Roman Empire. Look at what happened to Britain. You know, Britain has been the subject of many colonizations, from the early Celts, Indo-European farmers, to the Romans, then to the Anglo-Saxon, to the Normans, and all the times the culture changes and goes up and down. You know, we lose. A prime example, and the Roman Empire going. You know, it again changed society all across Europe and into Asia. So these things do happen. Certainly, if you step back on a larger timeline, it looks nice and smooth. But if you go to detail, there are, you know, things that happen. You know, there will be times when you can't afford to build the nicest looking castle. There will be times when, you know, the Britons, they are renowned for building nice bases of castles and a nice facade, but behind the scenes it's all mud. You know, it isn't that one part is from an advanced civilization and one is a recent one. No, it's just how they built their castles. So people have different pressures in them in society at different times that mean that they put different efforts into building, and this happens because societies do come and go. Landscape does change, but I don't think, you know, complete civilizations across the world die out and a new one comes up with a bit of knowledge from the old civilization that allows them to be advanced. I just do not see that. And certainly, from my aspect of myth making, because I've, you know, the knowledge we have on myth dispersal is incredible. As I say, I have literally, 50,000 items of data I look at, you know, across 1,100 editions of 1,100 odd locations. We see how myths disperse. We see a clear pattern that myths come out of Africa, go into Asia, across Europe, into North America, down into South America, as well as some go to Australia, and then another burst from probably, near Armenia, which will please you, and Turkey. You know, again, probably just post Younger Dryas, where there's a burst of new myth and belief coming out of that place. Now that is rather interesting. Why does that happen? And that primarily happens because of the use of pastoral farming, I believe, and the invention of horse riding, and the invention of the wheel, which was in Eastern Europe, according to more recent studies in the last 10 years, which created the horse and cart. And once you've got a horse and cart and a war chariot, the war chariot within 500 years, the knowledge of that spread thousands of miles. It was a game changer in terms of civilization. So to me, that is how I see the world. And I'm happy to discuss those points. That's easier.
Can I throw in a point there, Will?
Yeah. Throw in a point, and then I don't want to make sure that I miss my other points, but please do.
One of the areas that I'm interested to get John's feedback on is, so I've studied megalithic civilizations for a long, long time. The architecture, the specific way that they designed them. One of the fascinating concepts, and I want to get John's opinion on this, is that when we look at what we call grand civilizations that built amazing things, accomplished incredible things, when we look at them around the world, places where they built giant things, let's give you an example, like the Moai of Easter Island, right? The pre-Rapa Nui culture, as I'm going to call it. Or go look at Egypt in Aswan with the unfinished obelisk. Or go to Baalbek, Lebanon with the giant stone of the pregnant woman and the other ones that are still in the quarry. Or go to the Yangshan quarry in China. Okay? What do all those things have in common? All of those locations are part of grand civilizations that created incredible things. High capabilities to make amazing things. The problem is, though, every one of those examples I gave you, every time, whether it's the Moai or the unfinished obelisk or in Baalbek, Lebanon with the giant blocks or in Yangshan Quarry, every single of those examples, that culture had taken on the largest possible projects they had ever taken on, okay? Every case, like give an example, the Moai statue that never made it out of the quarry was like 3 times the size of any Moai that they had existing. And the obelisk in Egypt, in Aswan, would have been more than double the size of any obelisk that existed. Same thing for Baalbek, Lebanon, same thing for Yangshan. Now, a lot of people would say and jump on saying, well, it's because they tried to make something too big and they couldn't do it, so they abandoned the project. Or an earthquake cracked it, so they gave up on it. But here's the thing that's interesting. How would that be the case all around the world, completely different points, right? Where they're all taking on the largest projects they possibly did. Now, why would you do that? Well, you would do that because your civilization's the highest level it had possibly gotten to. So you want to create the most grand things possible. So then, how is it possible that all of those locations, all of the largest things they ever built, never made it out, and that civilization seemed to have been destroyed right after that point, or they just disappeared? Because there are no blocks that big anywhere else. But furthermore, those areas where they found those large stones were the most recent thing that they had worked on. So it wasn't like they were like in the back somewhere. They're like, yeah, remember that? We tried to do that. That was a bad idea. No, it's not. It's not like that. It seems like they were all taking on these grand projects, and then around the world, it all stopped. It just mysteriously disappeared and ended. Now, I want to add one more thing. We're working with Robert Schoch right now, a famous geologist who talks all about coronal mass ejections and damage on the Earth. And one of the things that's very attractive that we're exploring is a site called 𝗃𝗪𝗟 in Turkey, on the northwest side of Lake Van. When I just got a chance to visit there in May, what I photographed was at least 24 basalt blocks that had massive vitrification on them. I mean, completely melted across the top, where in some cases we actually had obsidian glass that had formed out of these events, and the blocks were strewn. The largest blocks at 𝗃𝗪𝗟 was between 10 and 20 tons, had tumbled down the mountain hundreds of feet and had landed down on the side of the hill, and across the top of it had massive melting and vitrification on it, as well as the huge artifact I call the Kef box relief that came from that had made its way all the way down to a town called the Gigives, which was more than half a mile or a mile down the mountain into this town. What kind of an event, okay, could have created those types of disastrous effects on these stones? Whereas in recent memory, when we look at the last 10,000 years, we don't see any major events that were like that, but we do during the Younger Dryas, which gives us this more comprehensive look at saying, well, we know the Younger Dryas had extreme heat effects, whether that was from an impact or some kind of coronal mass ejection. We know that it created a layer around the world of basically like fires and melting and burning. We see that, and we see these stones that are completely melted and from an event. So does that give us justification to say that they were built before the Younger Dryas?
I have to say, I'm not an archaeologist or geologist. However, I do not believe the Younger Dryas was a worldwide event where we see that all across the world. Okay, yes, things can happen for different reasons. There was a meteorite at the beginning of the 20th century, Russia, didn't crash into the land, but exploded over the forest. Hundreds of miles off. There are events that happen sometimes away from civilization, so no one knows about it. So I don't know. I can't answer specific things. Earthquakes, a number of things. If one thing doesn't explain it, it's sometimes a combination of events over time. Certainly, if you think these things are 20,000 years old, then there's far more chance of things happening naturally time after time after time for those to happen. If you think things are only 1,000 or 2,000 years old, then it's more likely to be a single event, but not necessarily. So I'd have to look at specific things, but I just do not believe the Younger Dryas was as significant as people think. In fact, it's more to do with global temperatures changing a few degrees, which actually causes the hunter-gatherers in Europe, and there's a paper on this from 2021, I can happily give you links to papers if you need these, that show how the hunter-gatherer societies were split apart on the Northern Alps. So we have a Western hunter-gatherers staying in Europe, the Eastern ones heading off towards into Anatolia, and then over time those Eastern ones break, and then an admixture, they come together again. Where they come together, this admixture are the people that create 𝗝𝗪𝗟𝗡 and the agricultural societies. That is what the Younger Dryas did, is it pushed human population of northern Mediterranean down together and forced us to mix, forced us to make some tough decisions about food and the like. And that's where that comes from. That's my understanding.
I would like to get into, there's plenty, obviously, but I want to touch on something that I know John has based a lot of his research in, and in an area that I don't get to at least hear a lot from Matt in, which are the Nordic myths. And now, Matt, I know a lot of your research covers, Mesopotamia, Turkey, Peru, from Cambodia, all those places, but I hear less of things coming from those Nordic myths. And so my question, I guess I should address it to John first. Nordic myths, do we see the same similarity? Is Matt going to be able to pull any sort of information or look for some confirmations between the things that he's pulling up from Peru, Mexico, Cambodia, the Eastern Turkey, and etc.? Did they share similar myth creation stories that would confirm some of the things that he's trying to confirm?
Okay, so So what we find is that the myths of the Near East do disperse across the northern Mediterranean and certainly into Greece. So we can see many examples of this. We see that is it 𝗪𝗟𝗟, the woman, the lady, the queen, I can't remember her name off the top of my head, turns into Ashtar and Ishtar, and Aphrodite and Venus. So you see this goddess moving.
Yeah.
So Aphrodite is not an Olympian goddess. She's come externally. But we also see myths of the underworld transport. In fact, the creation myth, the Enuma we see in Philo-Biblos to Hittite myth, all the way to the Greek creation myth of Gaia and Kronos eating kids. That is the Near Eastern creation myth. So we see myths all the time going from the Near East into Greece and Europe, and therefore when those spread and create their empires, those myths disperse even further, including influencing Nordic myths. So we have in Nordic myth the myth of Balder, who is going to the underworld type myth. That is definitely Neolithic. We have Freya, who is a woman with cats. Cats are very much a Neolithic agriculture, Near Eastern myth. But equally, we have the Indo-Europeans, who were pastoral farmers, and they succeeded because they could transport themselves across fields, because they eventually developed the wheeled cart and wagon and horses. And so we see those myths spread all the way from India through Persia, up through Europe, into Greece, although there's some overlap, because nothing's just polarised black and white. Things mix and come and go and come and go. And we see those go into the Nordic myths as well. And in fact, one of the few myths where Rome differs from Greece, because Rome tended to steal Greek culture in their stories, is the creation myth. The creation myth of Rome, with Romulus and Remus, is an Indo-European creation myth, where the creation myth of Greece is a Neolithic agricultural creation myth. So, yes, if there are myths in Turkey that happened pre 8,000 years ago, then there's a good chance that they have flowed into either the agricultural farming or the pastoral farming cultures and have spread. The only way those myths then get it into the Americas, if not by colonization later on, is if they were much older. And the real old myths that we got are dragons, which we haven't spoken about, Matt, and I've
just talk about Hermes and Poimander, right? Yeah.
That's a very deep conversation we go there, but certainly dragons and Quetzalcoatl and the like. The myth of death, and the story of Adam and Eve and the serpent in the Garden of Eden, that is a myth about the loss of immortality from Africa, and that goes into the Americas. The Ferryman of the Dead, find that in the Americas. That's a much older myth from Siberia. So we have a number of really old myths, so as in the dragons, which are really interesting, because that actually shows you how society and landscape influence myth, the evolution of dragon stories. Because I know how I think you think that they're a king or not, a figure of knowledge or something, and just where I have a different take on that based on how I see the evolution of the dragon myth. So yeah, there's certain old myths that everybody will have, certain ones that only we will see just in Eurasia because of their agricultural or pastoral farming myths.
Matt, do you want to touch on a bit?
Sure. Yeah. Now, the overlaps are uncanny between the Nordic myths with others, especially like Mesopotamia and Egypt, like John said. So there's an overlap there. One of the reasons I don't focus on that area is that I know that area was under ice or very, very uninhabitable before the Younger Dryas. So that's simply why areas like the Nordic region, Scandinavia, Ireland, those areas I don't typically focus on, because what I see from the cultures that are there, like the Druids and others, is that they created stone circles and others, but they're very primitive work. The stones are very crudely carved. They're clearly mimicking an understanding of tracking time and just tracking events, celestial events. Certainly they understood that, but they completely lacked the ability to create anything sophisticated. And that's actually one of the points that I want to bring up, that I think it's a bit of a backwards way to maybe help explain, and I won't say prove, but I'll say strongly suggest that the cultures that originally were there, especially like in Turkey and Sumer, were earlier than the Younger Dryas. And let me tell you why. If you study the Urartian culture, which is a culture that was around 3,000 years ago, according to mainstream scientists in Eastern Turkey, Armenia region, you'll see that there are heavy overlaps with Akkadian civilizations down to the south. Overlaps to the point where they were at war. They were actually extensively at war. They were fighting a lot. And you learned that, okay, so the Urartian culture was quite a war culture. It was actually an empire. And then you learn about how they treated the gods and how they portrayed them and showed them. What was really interesting, actually, in studying this, and this is, of course, the focus of my research, was that a lot of the sites that I believe are pre-Urartian, like Ionis or 𝗃𝗪𝗟 and others, have very specific symbols and depictions that were shown there that have nothing to do with the ideology of the Urartians. Nothing. Which is why it's so peculiar to look at something like how there's no war ever shown in these symbols. In fact, the gods that are there later shown as war gods to the Urartians were like fertility gods of life and bringers of life and other aspects. And aspects of like the tree of life and bringing knowledge for understandings of the law of correspondence and the knowledge of the relationship between the earth, the sun, and the moon, and the cosmos, and our relationship to the entire thing. What I find fascinating is that none of that's shared by the Urartians. If anything, it seemed as though they were building on top of these sacred sites and using these altars and symbols and gods for very bad reasons. And give you an example. We found evidence at Ionis of weapons that were there stored and shields and other things, and that they found evidence of swords that had been used in rituals above the altar there to infuse them with the energy of Haldi so that they could win a battle. Okay? And there are depictions from the Urartians of Haldi where he's shown very different than he is earlier. He's got like fire coming out of them. He's got a big spear, and he's basically he's a war god. But the problem is, though, that's not how they're depicted at all before. In the original stonework of the basalt and andesite, it shows them as being like we see in other parts of the world that are ancient, like in ancient Mesopotamia and Sumer, with these these divine tree of life passing the seeds of knowledge with like a, the hand basket, or even in Lake Vaughan, in case of 𝗪𝗪𝗛𝗪 and Ionis, it's like a cup. And every depiction is showing something about balance, the balance of cycles and understanding of how reality works. And so when I was looking into that, I realized that the entire Urartian, not only their building style, but their mentalities of how they treated these symbols and how they treated the understanding of them was almost perverted. It was completely backwards, and they were very disrespectful to all the ancient traditions, and they were using them for their own gain through war and through empire building, and they subsequently just poof disappeared and never existed ever again. And nobody actually knows what happened to the Urartians. But the problem, the thing, what I'm trying to bring up here is that clearly it seems that they were very distinctive, different cultures that had built there. One with this very pure, very no evidence of war or anything like that in this pre-culture, had built all these beautiful, spectacular sun temples. And then here you have this example with a later culture that's very warlike, that adopts the original symbols and then makes them into their own. But it doesn't make sense to me that those original symbols could have meant what the Urartians had thought they meant, because it wouldn't have jived with what the original message was. So that's actually one of the pieces of evidence that I use to say, look, this is from a completely different culture, because it doesn't share any of the cultural understanding of the Urartians, the abilities of creating and moving stone and the work that they're doing, as well as culturally. It's very interesting that artistically, you can tell a lot about a culture by its type of art and how sophisticated they would leave behind things that were based on cultural advancement. The Urartians were not very artistic. They did not create a lot of the original earlier stuff. In fact, archaeologists at some of the sites were kind of confused about how different some of the artifacts were in some of the sites compared to the Urartian stuff. They didn't know how to jive it and mesh it. And Will John knows that, and then by them imposing some of their Urartian views and saying the symbols were like lances and spears, even though you can clearly see it's the tree of life symbol, completely flips it on its head for what the original message was. And so that's what I'm the point I'm trying to make, is that the mythos of these cultures seems to come from their origins or before their origins and was passed to them. But there seems to be a very distinctive separation between civilizations that seem to understand different aspects of balance and within nature and the cosmos and within our own consciousness and divinity, versus cultures that came later that were very primitive in comparison, very warlike, just consuming and going to war with others and destroying a lot of things. And so I don't see any comparisons with those cultures at all. In fact, it looks like just completely different time periods of history. And I know that's not necessarily mythology, but we're looking at a time period of human history that I think is far more complicated than the 6,000-year narrative of a rise of civilization that we're told.
Okay. So civilization's been going a bit longer than 6,000 years, but there's a fair, again, lots of information there, Matt, and I'm not going to be able to answer everything. So disappointed you think that there was a lack of cultural advanced stuff going on in Europe, or to India. So we find in cave paintings, for example, 20,000 years old, that Europe were having calendars there, understanding migrations, animal migrations, farming, things that just weren't happening in Turkey. And that's kind of art. Now, I'm not saying art didn't exist, but we just haven't found equivalents. So there's a culture there in Europe happening that just is not existing around Armenia and Turkey and those places. The other thing, so that things change. When you're in a society, things change. Now, I'm not overly familiar with the Urartians. I would imagine you know a lot more than me, but I am aware that they had a big sun temple that was destroyed at some point during their sort of 1,000 years of existing this society. Now, it could be, because I have seen this before, that when a society undergoes a major incident like that, it changes its gods. We see this, for example, Jews didn't believe in hell until Cyrus the Great came in, took over their land, and they thought, of course, Cyrus the Great's good, they must have better gods. What do they gods do? Oh, they've got a heaven and hell. let's put hell in the Bible. Or indeed, in the Germanic tribes in Old Norse, their god was Tyr, their war god, and then suddenly Odin took over when the Roman Empire expanded and tried to go into Germany. We see societies significantly change when issues happen. And why do issues happen? Because as society grows, civilizations grow, cities grow, more and more people grow, and there will be conflict. One of the things people want as society grows is more land, more ownership, and so there will be conflict, there will be changes. So this isn't just a reflection on sort of how you want to be a society, it's a reflection on how other societies were happening. So I think that really needs to be perhaps better understood when you're making these arguments, so you can at least say that wasn't a factor in this happening. Because I believe, having seen how societies grow and conflict all the time and how they change, that to me sounds like a catalyst for these things happening. And one other thing actually about the sword and the dagger, that was a key Indo-European cult. There was a cult of the sword, cult of the dagger, and we see this in things like Excalibur and King Arthur, where he throws the sword away. The ownership of a sword and daggers were really key aspects of being a king and a warrior back then, over the last 8,000 or maybe 6,000 years. So, yeah, that's why these things happened. There are cultural traits that existed to have that.
You both touched on dragon myth, and
Yes.
I am not up to date on my dragon myth knowledge. So if you both wouldn't mind,
I would love to talk about that. I could, yeah,
please
for sure.
cluing me in on that, because I know they share a very important place in a lot of ancient cultures. What they are and what they represented, though, I know is potentially contested. So maybe we could discuss.
You want me to start first or John first?
I don't know which one of you guys feels more dragon mythy.
But our stories will be very different, so it doesn't really matter, I think. Off you go,
Okay.
Matt.
All right,
Off
please,
you go,
Matt,
Matt. Okay.
go for it.
Okay, so it's very interesting that you learned that there were symbols that represented specific gods. I mean, if you look at the Sumerian pantheon, we know that one of the primary symbols of Enki was the serpent, and we see that throughout in different things. Now, what's very interesting about the serpent is that what is the metamorphosis of the serpent into a higher form but the dragon? And we see that metamorphosis concept all throughout the world. And I want to give probably the best example for that is in the Americas. Now, in the Americas, we know that the Maya worshipped the original god Kukulkan, who was a winged dragon, a serpent, winged dragon serpent. And we find out if you go a little ways away over to the Aztec and pre-Aztec, you find out that Quetzalcoatl was also they called it a winged feathered dragon, basically, right? Winged feathered serpent or dragon. They didn't use this term dragon. They usually used like a feathered serpent as their way to describe it, okay? Which is essentially a dragon. Now, down in South America, if you go down into, parts of Peru and Bolivia, you find out that there was another serpent dragon influence there called 𝗪𝗪𝗪. Okay, not very well known, actually. Not super well known, not as well described and as well depicted as we see Quetzalcoatl and Kukulkan. Now, but all three of those are all feathered serpent gods. Okay, they show a serpent in its highest form, and it's got wings, and it shows it as that. Now, one of the really interesting things when you go into the Americas, and I don't know if John knows this, but one of the indigenous names that they used to describe the Americas was 𝗪𝗪𝗪. Okay, and it was called 𝗪𝗪𝗪 because it's the land of the feathered serpent, and that's, of course, we see Quetzalcoatl and Kukulkan and all of those. However, Quetzalcoatl and Kukulkan are not described as being an actual feathered serpent dragon at all. They're described as being a great sage who traveled from another place that then taught and created civilization, which is why when Cortez conquered the Aztec Empire, he was able to do so because he pretended he was the returning god Quetzalcoatl. Okay? Now, that would only happen if Quetzalcoatl looked like some kind of a man that resembled somehow a foreigner from another land that came from somewhere else that wasn't like them. And it's also because Cortez arrived supposedly on the actual date that Quetzalcoatl had said that he would return, which brings up the whole questions of if the church knew all about that and actually timed that for a very specific reason. The point I'm trying to make is the whole concept of a winged feathered serpent is simply a metaphor. There's not a real thing that looks like that. It's about teachings. And we know that the serpent represented these teachings of earth and these teachings of higher consciousness. Because, like, give you an example, look at the medical caduceus today. We see, right, a rod with a spiral of energy around it with wings at the top. And we see that, of course, with Hermes and all the depictions that we have of that. But what is that? Well, the rod is the spinal cord. Okay, and you see the energy coil around it is the energy that emerges within the human. It's this emergence of kundalini, of higher states of consciousness. And it's commonly depicted, especially in India, as a coiled serpent. It's like this energy that's waiting, that gets unlocked within us, okay? Now, those terms have been used interchangeably as like a teacher, like teaching higher wisdom to a culture, and then them ascending to a higher place, which is why we see those depictions. Now, it's interestingly also that in one of the most famous Hermetic texts of all, right, Hermes and great 𝗲𝗪𝗛𝗒 the dragon, is 𝗲𝗪𝗛𝗒 describes himself as being like the great god and the god and highest archetype of like the universe, like the creator of everything. And he's having a conversations with Hermes, and he's telling him all about like how things are and how the creation came to be, how we came to be here, and how things work. And it's described how he's like the great dragon god of the universe. And so that concept of a feathered serpent into its highest form has been shared throughout for being like a great enlightener of knowledge, or even source like God sometimes, as that being the symbol for it. And so now the big question is, well, if that's true, then why did the Maya and the Aztec become blood sacrificing and doing all those horrible things they did? Is because I believe, based on everything I've studied, is that the original culture that founded those temples and those teachings was long gone by the time the Aztec and Maya had become very corrupted. And there's evidence that perhaps they had an entire collapse of farming through different climatic events at their time period, and they were desperate, and they were in all these different things. Regardless, I don't think that what we see as the Aztec and Maya later doing the terrible things that they did was at all representative of the original cultures that were there and their belief systems. And so clearly that had changed over time into something very different than it was later. But that's my understanding of the concept of the dragon and how it ties in with our ascension and even lost civilizations.
Okay, so interesting fact, Church of the Latter-day Saints thinks Quetzalcoatl was Jesus.
Well, it was like a sage, right? They're just sages and teachers.
Sages, well, that's, yes. So, and so you can disprove that. That'd be quite cool. So dragons, so they mentioned a couple of things here, dragons and sacrifice, both very interesting. So I'll give you a history of dragons based on the mythology data I have, which is vast. So dragon stories came from Africa, where the dragon gave water to the land for life, basically. We see, and so that's why rivers bend like through the landscape, but that's the story. And we see that go off into Australia. So when we leave Africa and go through Asia down to Australia, they have the rainbow serpent, does exactly the same thing. The stories are the land's dry, the snake comes up, makes the land where everything grows. And that's what it is. We then see the next oldest version of the story in Asia and China, where the dragon still gives water and actually is the source of some of the greatest rivers in China and the surrounding countryside. But it does it against the wishes of the ruler. And so the ruler traps the dragons under mountains. But that's, again, the dragons give water and life. And those dragons, so the dragons that come out of Africa, yes, some are snake-like, but some are chimeras, so liony bird-type figures. They end up, say, in Asia, then they go to Australia. But the Asian ones get more feathery and more human-like features. And as they go down into Oceania and migrate about 8,000 years going to South America, they are the feathery-looking dragons we see in myth today. Now, what happens is that then we start agriculture, and the dragon isn't giving us water. We need water, and our crops aren't growing. Where the dragon is the source of water. What happens? They create gods that fight dragons, and you get Indra versus Vitra, and you see it in is it in English or you see fights between.
That's a Hindu mythology, yeah.
The Tiamat, yeah. Well, the Vitra, Indra Vitra, but also I think the sort of Tiamat fight. You could argue Marduk Tiamat is.
Tiamat is like a dragon in that, yeah.
Yeah, serpent. Well, it means deep water. So we create gods that fight dragons to give us water. Okay, but then we see that myth develop in the Indo-Europeans who don't agriculturally farm. They farm cows. So their dragons steal cows, and we see this in myth, and that goes into India and all the way into Europe. It's called the cattle raiding myth, and we actually see that go back into Africa with migrations. That's sort of quite interesting. But then what happens is we don't tell our stories in contemporary language. We tell our ancient stories in poems, and we tell them in poems because it's easier to remember because we haven't got writing. That's why all the ancient texts are poetry, because that's how we used to tell the stories before we wrote them down. It's poems. And because we can't always find words that rhyme with dragon, we use metaphors and similes and analogies and kennings and whatever you want to call it. So in Persia, they use the term Dunu to describe dragons stealing females that lactate, meaning cows. When it gets to India, they mistranslate that as women that give milk. So they must mean important women like queens. And so when the Greeks come along and find these Indian myths and take them back, suddenly dragons now steal princesses. And that's how the evolution of the dragon myth has gone from a dragon that's like giving water to dragons steal princesses and end up in towers. We see quite a clear and really convincing argument for that in terms of the mythical sources we have for that. So that's that story. Now, something else I'd like to talk about is you talk about blood sacrifice. And this is really important to understand in terms of religion, sacrifice. So how we used to act, and this is from the studies of people like 𝗪𝗟𝗟𝗪 and the like, they've done some excellent work on this. When before modern times, everything we did was deliberate. It was done in a sacred way. So when you cooked, you gave thanks to the gods. When you ate, you gave thanks to the gods. When you hunted, you gave thanks to the gods. When you harvested, you gave thanks to the gods. When you planted, everything was sacred and for a reason. And in effect, you created these myths, but when you had a religion, you had to have rituals, and rituals emulated myth. Okay, so what we find is many of the rituals that happened emulate stories in the myth. And one of the creation myths that happened later on, so gone is the world is water, but we then see the world is made up of a giant or primordial being. This happens in the 𝗪𝗟𝗪𝗟, where Tiamat's cut in half, creates the firmament. That is, so the world is created from there. Well, that is a popular myth amongst at least half the world. And in the Indo-Europeans, where it's best documented, we see that what they did in order to reenact the myth of the world of creation is so where they sacrificed a giant in the myth to create the world and people, they sacrificed a person. And because they were recreating the creation myth, and that gave magic to the universe. And then eventually people didn't want to die, and they sacrificed cows and then horses and then pigs and goats. And then we eventually decided actually do statues and then nothing at all, because it's actually quite a bad idea. So don't do religion, kids, is the moral of that story. But that is why we see sacrifices. And I thought there was a practical reason as well, is that most of the sacrifices we see tend to be prisoners of war, because they're too expensive to look after. You couldn't feed them, you get nowhere to put them. So that's why we see that from Europe through Asia and into the Americas, that where there was conflict, especially with the Spanish in the Americas, but also German and Romans, the Germanic tribes killed basically all the Roman prisoners of war because they had nothing to do with them. So why not give them to the gods? So right. That's a touch on the sacred and profane, as Eliada would call it.
And I know we're slowly running out of time, but there are two more questions that I'd love to cover if you guys have just a couple, maybe 15 minutes more. Is that cool?
Okay. Is that all right?
With both of you guys? All right. So there's one that I love to always poke the bear, as we should say, and I do this more with Jon, and I haven't yet gotten to discuss this at length with Matt. But for many people, Jesus is a myth. For obviously a very large section of society, that is a very sacrilegious thing to state, even to suggest. And I know the story of Jesus and let's say, I guess, parts of the myth or parts of his story can be found within other cultures previous to him, which is fairly well known. And so, Matt, I'm just curious, since we've never talked about this, what do you find when you look at the literal story of Jesus as well as the myths surrounding him and what it means to human civilization?
I think it's a very interesting story, and the more I've definitely looked at it pretty extensively, and there are aspects that are woven into mythology, certainly within the story. I know Jon's going to say that. If you look especially with like the Egyptian narratives of like Osiris and the whole idea of a virgin mother and virgin birth and all that stuff, clearly that's been borrowed from earlier mythology, and I'm in a complete agreement with Jon there. But the one thing that I want to bring into this is that, like, let's give you an example. Throughout cuneiform tablets out of Mesopotamia, they talk about these 𝗝𝗪𝗛𝗡 and these teachers, these great sages that travel around. There's 7 of them. Of course, there's 7 colors in the visible light spectrum, 7 chakras, right? Now, it's very interesting because the sages are brought up in a very specific way as being very important. The first sage ever in history is known as Adapa. And Adapa, it's called the myth of Adapa. It's quite famous, is that he's supposed to be this extremely wise and knowledgeable human who travels around with a group and teaches and enlightens cultures and civilizations. And there's direct comparisons with, I believe, with Adapa and the 𝗝𝗪𝗛, with even stories like the Dogon, with the Nomo, and this, and being a fish head. And a lot of people will be like, wait a minute, so isn't the Nomo supposed to have a fish head? Well, I think it's representing a previous age of Pisces. And it's really talking about an age of teaching enlightenment and teaching knowledge. Now, but what about the real aspects of it? Well, clearly Adapa was real, a real figure, just like I believe that Hermes was a real figure at some point in history too. And just like I think 𝗝𝗪𝗛𝗡 and 𝗪𝗪𝒻 were real individuals, real sages that taught wisdom and created civilization, not just a generic group that decided they want to do it, but something very divine, something where they were actually had been maybe communicated or been given information from somewhere, probably from a higher sources of you need to enlighten the world and teach them and bring civilization here, some kind of a purpose, because people had to have reasoning to want to do what they were doing. And you're literally going out and creating civilizations. Now, getting back to the Jesus story, I think there are definitely parallels that Jesus may have really lived and just been a sage of his time. But I think what the Holy Roman Empire and the church did with Constantine was they got very creative with the Jesus story in order to capitalize on it for their own benefits for use of control. And that's where I come around it, is that, for instance, like, Jesus saying like the kingdom of heaven is within you. It's very interesting how the whole concept of Jesus later in the Holy Roman Empire and in Christianity became like this great savior of mankind, but it's not something that you could ever obtain. Like, you have to follow the teachings of that, but not that you are your own savior. And that's essentially what I think a lot of the interesting aspects of how they twisted it around and changed some of it was into this individual who is almost like we have to follow, but can't ever achieve that understanding. And so the story of Jesus, I think, has a lot of interesting aspects that connect to ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, with the original stories we find there, but then was changed around into basically this, you could call it like the entire focus of the Christian empire, or the Christian religion becoming focused around that concept of Jesus. But I don't think it was originally ever based on what it was supposed to be, which was just a traveling sage that was enlightening people that he was coming across. That's usually all stories come from some aspect of truth. They don't usually come out of nothing. There's some aspect of something that was real at some point that comes from. Now, whether or not it was completely changed into something later is a whole nother story, and that the original purpose of that message may have been lost over time. But I think that most of those things are based on something original that was real.
John, I know you have interesting thoughts on Jesus that we've discussed before, but I don't know.
Certainly the Son of God as in the New Testament didn't exist. Yeah, there could have been travelling sages, as Matt says, that may have influenced the story, but definitely not. I also agree that, yes, the Roman Catholic Church created a decent power base and created a religion that was easy to join. You know, you didn't have to get skin cut off your penis. If you're a child, you could join. You know, if you're a female, you could join. You could, in fact, the minute before you die, you can then forgive yourself for all your sins and you still go to heaven. Why would you not want to join this religion over anything else?
There you go.
It is a totally man-made, super duper, you know, sort of thing you expect to buy from Alibaba and .com now. It's really cheap, easy religion. Not really, but yeah, I could say that of all religions. I'm not just digging on the Christians. All religions are a bit odd in many ways. So yeah, not like that. And this comes back to the other thing comes back to our discussion at the start, which is myth and the truths. You consider myths having narrative truths. I consider them symbolic truths, and I think that's just a difference we're not going to agree on for a number of myths.
And then last but not least, of course, and I don't know any myths surrounding the pyramids necessarily. Now, I know that there are pyramids and all over, and obviously I'm discussing the Egyptian pyramids when I say pyramids, but there's a whole host of, from as far out as conspiracy to simply just, you know, the great mainstream intellectuals just bickering back and forth on how they were built, what they were for, what's the use of them, what stories that they told, you know. And so, John, I'm curious, just have you touched into anything as to what these could possibly be?
Yes.
Are they tombs, John? Are they tombs?
Yeah, well, they're mastabas, I think they called them, didn't they, in the Egyptian times? So like an underground tomb, and then they built one on top of another, but much like the ziggurats of Sumeria, which probably influenced them. And then as they got better, we can see, I think it's Pharaoh Djoser built the first step one after you got the mastabas, and then there's others, ones which are dodgy angles, I don't know all of them, until eventually you get to the pyramids of Giza. So it's just a natural progression of technology builds, a gradual progression of technology over probably 700 years or so, 800 years the pyramids were built. Nothing overly special. I think water was involved, a bit of sand, a bit of copper, a bit of flint in terms of engraving. They're not built with as many blocks as people think because there's a lot of gravel and mini rocks inside. So it is impressive, but it's not as impressive as some people want to make out. But yeah, nothing particularly...
Nothing out of the ordinary.
Mystery, yeah. No, they're very possible.
Well, so the pyramids, obviously, we get that's like a whole show in itself. I think it's really interesting how there is, I don't know if John's aware, but there's substantial evidence to show that in the 1800s that supposedly the name Khufu found in the Great Pyramid was found during that time. A cartouche saying Khufu was found, but there's actually a lot of evidence showing that there may have been a forgery in the 1800s. Now, I'm sure John's aware, but there's never been any other inscriptions found anywhere in the three Great Pyramids at all, describing who they were built for. Not only that, but there's never been a tomb found at all with any pharaohs, or actually any even any evidence that there was pharaohs ever built there. I'll give you an example. Let's look at a site like the Osirion, right? The Osirion's a really interesting place in you go down to Saqqara and throughout that whole area of Egypt, and you find these subterranean tunnels and areas that go down that have these giant granite boxes that are massive, multi-ton boxes that are actually larger than the entrances to even get down in them, which brings up the question of how they even brought them down there, or if they carved them down inside and then carved the chamber around it. But we're told that Apis bulls were buried in this as like a like a religious reason or something to do with the ancient Egyptian, mythology or whatever they were dealing with Apsis bowls. But we've never found any evidence of Apsis bowls at all. And so it really brings up the question of, if we've never found any tombs or anyone being buried, why do we still think that that's the narrative for what they did there? I find it very interesting around the world that so many of these places are considered tombs, but there's no evidence that anyone was ever actually buried there. Like even Madain Saleh in Saudi Arabia, these giant mountains carved out of single stone walls and cliffs where there are doorways that don't go anywhere. There's nothing inside them, but yet we're told that they were tombs. So there's a lot of questions that still get brought up. And swinging back to the Great Pyramid of Giza, looking at how mathematically perfect that structure is, again, with the ratios of being aligned to true north, being like a half hemisphere ratio of the Earth, regarding the Earth, sun, and the moon, why would you go to all those lengths to make something that perfect and that incredible to the cosmos that it literally represents like this half ratio of Earth if you're just going to bury somebody in it and just put a tomb in there? It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And I think it actually really diminishes the how unbelievably sophisticated and advanced some of these cultures were doing some of these things, to just want to bury somebody there and then call it a day. But I know John and I could probably have a whole show talking about that. But my opinion that's shared by others is that there are aspects of Egypt, just like in Turkey that I was talking about, where there's evidence of a completely older culture that predated the dynastic Egyptians by many, many, many thousands of years, that had originally built those structures, including the Sphinx. And then other cultures came later, like the dynastic Egyptians, and recarved and altered things and wrote their spray paint hieroglyphics on, and all of these aspects. But I mean, to me, it's clear that there's more going on there than just simply saying, well, the dynastic Egyptians decided to have a whole bunch of slave labor and create a bunch of tombs for their culture.
Can I ask one quick question then? The mastabas, do you think they were burial tombs?
I'm sorry, the what? What are
mastabas? They're the single-story brick layouts in Egypt we see.
I think that those might have been tombs, because I think that the dynastic Egyptians did build things. There are pyramids there that are not from the same time period. So there's clearly a mixture of, I think, different cultural influences there. Like, and give you a great example. Not in Egypt, but let's go to Baalbek, Lebanon for a minute. Okay? We know that Baalbek, Lebanon, the Temple of Jupiter, was incorporated by by the Roman Empire, by the Byzantine Empire when they were conquering that area. They definitely built right on top of it. It's clear that they did. But what's weird is that there are gigantic stones underneath that are literally some of the largest in the world, that we know that there's no examples of the Romans ever moving stones that big anywhere else in the world. And yet they're present in that location. It seems more like the Romans were aware of an earlier history and where it was important to them. It was sacred to them. The sites were important. There's one that I'm investigating in Turkey right now that is actually a brand new site that I haven't unveiled yet, where clearly the Roman Empire was very interested in. Now, what did they know? What did they understand about the past? Was it just based on planetary gods? Right? Like they thought about each planet having its own god? Or was there an ancient history that the Romans were aware of? Like a truly ancient history? Because we see even in places like, give you an example, during World War II, with when we had the Nazis going down into Baalbek, Lebanon and others, and taking the swastika symbol from an ancient symbol, an ancient cultural symbol of infinity and life, and taking and turning it into a war symbol. So there's been a lot of inversion and stealing things and changing things around. But more importantly, there's been a lot of ancient understanding of something that once was that no longer was anymore. And they seem to understand that, like unlike what we do.
Did you want to add any? We still got a second if you wanted to add a little.
No, religion is a funny old thing. It makes you have weird beliefs, but it is all man-made, because the first creation myths did not have a god. That's how I started this show. They didn't have a god because God wasn't created. God came to be when we started living together and needed a personified being we could recognise as a leader. And that's how we start to get the sort of gods we talk about today. So, yeah, no, religion makes you believe things, and myths appear out of nowhere. because of superstition, gossip, and a lack of understanding. It's a way of answering things you don't understand.
We didn't even talk about the gods. Isn't that funny? This whole thing, we never even talked about the gods.
Exactly.
Round 2. That's for round 2. I know both of your fan groups, which is what I love. I mean, this is the idea of having both of you guys on here, especially because I watch both of you guys, but I never get to actually put you guys together and have a conversation like this. And so it grows your knowledge base tremendously when you're able to put forth different aspects and different knowledges, knowledge bases, let's say. And, so thank you to both of you guys, obviously, for being here. I know you both your groups of fans, which may not have a whole ton of crossover, but maybe some, like me, will really enjoy this. And I know, Matt, obviously, you've written a couple of books. John, and you've written tons of papers, but I don't think a book is out.
No, I was meant to write one this year, but I've been too busy. Too many holidays, been retired.
Okay.
Can I just say, John, that it was really a pleasure, John.
Oh, well, was Matt?
To
Yes,
you, John, that you have a very, very deep depth of knowledge, and I think that one of the things that's really been lost on our societies now is just to be able to have discussions, have conversations, throw different ideas around, and not get upset about if someone else says something that doesn't agree with you. Like, I feel like we really lost that. It's nice to be able to bring that back in a really good conversation, John.
Thanks, Matt. I totally agree. It's this had every opportunity to be a very different conversation, and I'm glad we can both listen and understand each other's viewpoints. And it's been very, very interesting.
Yeah, I agree, especially because we're going to have the cage match later, August 31st.
We should talk about the gods. That would be a fun conversation. I would like to do that.
Yeah, definitely. I know we can do this again, and hopefully in person, as I've been screaming at John and saying that we're going to make that happen. And so we'll definitely try and do that. I think you guys, it would be cool to meet. So obviously we will link to both of your guys' channels, everything that you guys have done, all of your great work. Everybody, you guys can check that out in the description box or in the show notes if you're just listening to this. And once again, thanks a lot, guys. We will see you in the next one.
Thank you, Will. Thank you, John. I really enjoyed this.
Yeah.